My name is Brian Kniff. I'm Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, and I'm here tonight to welcome all of you to our 4th annual Ignatian Values in Action lecture. Here at the University of Scranton, this lecture is very important to us. It is one of the many ways we introduce the newest members of our community, our first-year students, this year's class of 2019. They're all sitting right up here looking just great. This is one of the ways we introduce them to our Jesuit and Ignatian tradition and to the core values of our institution, primarily by providing them with people who live lives according to these values. Now tonight, I'm the guy who gets to give a few directions and then move the program along. So I have just 3 bits of instruction. For our first-year students, you should have swiped in with your Royal card. So if you didn't, swipe out when the lecture is over. We had all kinds of juniors, seniors swiping in. I appreciate the cooperation, but you didn't have to do that. It's just the first-year students. So when you're done, if you haven't swiped in, please swipe so your faculty and especially your deans will know that you were here tonight. Second, after the lecture, we will have an opportunity for a book signing. Sister Helen will kindly sign copies of Dead Man Walking or whatever other books you'd like her to sign. That will take place. I'm not going to try to return after the lecture and direct you then, but it will take place over here on my right. There's a table set up for the book signing. So we will just give Sister Helen a couple of minutes to catch her breath, compose herself, and be ready to sign. If you would like your book signed, please go around the back, and there is a nice red cordon set up to direct you towards the table. On your way, while you're waiting in line, you can learn about some of our service projects. You can take a selfie with Pope Francis if you would like to do that. He's over there waiting for you. And basically make the most of your time in line. The third bit of directions is please silence your cell phones and any other electronic devices you have with you. One of the great things about our Jesuit heritage is that it's about presence and it's about attention. And tonight is a time when we give all of our presence and all of our attention to our honored guest. So I ask you to do that. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Dr. Michael Jenkins from our Department of Sociology, Criminal Justice, and Criminology, who will introduce Sister Helen.
Good evening. As Dean Conniff just mentioned, my name is Michael Jenkins, and I'm an assistant professor in the Criminal Justice, Sociology, and Criminology department here at the university. On behalf of the College of Arts and Sciences and the University of Scranton, I welcome you to the 4th annual Ignatian Values in Action lecture. It is a great honor to be here to embrace Sister Helen Prejean as the newest member of the Scranton family, and to be able to comment on the righteous work she has done in bringing attention to the challenges of our criminal justice system. We are happy to report that just this past week, her efforts on the Richard Glossip case in Oklahoma have resulted in the courts granting a 2-week stay just hours before Glossip was set to be killed by the state. Nonetheless, there remains much to be done to prevent the execution of someone who, as much evidence suggests, may be innocent. Universities across the country have taken part in their own summer reading and fall lecture programs. They highlight the innovative, entrepreneurial, and motivational attributes of authors and the stories that they tell. They impress upon us the need to work diligently and passionately to achieve our goals. Here at the University of Scranton, through our Ignatian Values in Action lecture series, we've studied the lives of those who offer similar messages and who also exemplify a life of rousing service to something much greater. They partake in, as Sister Prejean says, soul-sized work. These lectures highlight the efforts of those who serve on the margins of our society, those who live out our University of Scranton Jesuit and Catholic values by ministering to the unemployed, the undereducated, and the socioeconomically underprivileged. In her most well-known role as spiritual advisor to those sentenced to death row, Sister Prejean comforts a population whose members are disproportionately represented by all of these disadvantaged classes. They're also a population of people who have been convicted of murder, rape, and other heinous crimes. A group that, in our individualistic and pull-yourself-up-by-the-bootstraps society, is too easily forsaken, pushed aside by the political, legal, and religious systems, the lepers of our day. Sister Prejean, following the examples of grace-filled figures before her, has devoted her life to focusing the spotlight on the injustices of the lethal lottery that determines who lives and who dies for the crimes for which they've been too often wrongfully convicted. She's done so in a powerful way. Her first book, Dead Man Walking, which you were all supposed to have read for tonight, details her experiences of the death penalty in practice. It enjoyed 31 weeks on the New York Times bestsellers list and was made into an Oscar-winning film starring Susan Sarandon as Sister Helen. In her second book, The Death of Innocence, Sister Helen employs an authoritative moral reasoning and the logic of an expert criminal justician in arguing against the death penalty. Her commitment to truth and justice, mixed with humor and an unending hope for seeing the good in all, have made her one of the most sought-after champions of the death penalty abolitionist movement in the United States and abroad. She's served on and chaired numerous boards: the National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty, Amnesty International, Murder Victim Families for Reconciliation, and the Moratorium Campaign. She currently heads the ministry against the death penalty. These worldly accomplishments aside, what makes Sister Helen Prejean a most fitting Ignatian Values and Action lecturer is her unwavering devotion to the service of others, her seeking the good in all things, and her being the good in others' most dispiriting moments. Her life stands as a challenge and as an inspiration to all of us as we discern our part in reflecting God's goodness out into the world. No matter how inadequate we may feel, how unprepared we might be, how limited we are, or how damaged our lives have left us, it is our responsibility as individuals who've been given another day on this earth to do what we can, each in our own way, to comfort the afflicted, stand with those on the edges, and to seek a faith that does justice. This is the way that God works, whether through Noah, Moses, the apostles, St. Ignatius, Sister Helen, or through us. Be willing, and it will become. Now, it is our great pleasure to welcome Sister Helen Prejean to the podium to share about her journey in becoming the rock star sister that we've all come to admire.
Thank you. I don't know about that rock star thing. When you're a nun and you get famous, you know what it means? It just means you do more work. People say, hey, sister, can you do that? Hey, sister, can you do that? I just want to tell you a story of faith unfolding. The best way I know to describe grace is that God wakes us up. If you think about it, you can't wake yourself up. If you're not awake, you're not awake. And it was awakening to that gospel of justice and not just being a nun. I was sweet to my students in 7th and 8th grade. I taught them English and religion. I wasn't one of those knuckle-hitting nuns, hitting kids and stuff. And I thought the gospel of Jesus called us to be charitable, be kind to everybody, but I didn't know anything about justice. And I want to tell you that story of how it unfurled. But I want to take you first into this incredible thing that I got swooped up into. I think God is the big swooper. I think there ought to be T-shirts printed called Sneaky Jesus. Pope Francis talks about the God of surprises. God comes in and surprises us. Well, that's what happened. And I want to tell you briefly about this man, Richard Glossip, because he so epitomizes all that's broken with the system of death in this country and indeed the whole criminal justice system. This man, Richard, who had never had a traffic ticket in his life, has been sitting in his isolated cell in Oklahoma, close to where the killing chamber is, where he is very aware that the last 2 people executed there by experimental death with drugs by Oklahoma died a tortured death. Charles Warner, who died before him in January, was screaming, "Acid is flowing through my body." Because the Supreme Court of the United States, at this moment in our history, is allowing states to experiment with drugs that it takes to kill a person. The Veterinarians Association of the United States does more monitoring of drugs and the administration of those drugs to euthanize animals than we have for the killing of human beings in this country at this time. Richard didn't murder anybody. It was really clear that Richard, in the scenario the prosecution presented, was not a murderer. Their scenario that they presented is that the murderer, who's admitted murdering a man, Barry Van Treese, his name is Justin Sneed, has a life sentence in a medium security prison in Oklahoma because he went to rob a man and he admitted to murdering him. It's called a life sentence on a soft yard. It's what you would hope for the most in a sentence. How is Richard even on death row and awaiting execution when he didn't murder anyone? Solely on the word of Justin Sneed. And when you look at the video, and they're doing studies of this, of the police detectives, he was a 19-year-old kid, heavily addicted to meth, who had gone in to rob to get money for drugs, as was his custom. That's what he did. And the police detectives, you can see it on the video, were throwing him the softballs. Well, we know you're not in this by yourself, Justin. And they introduce into it Richard Glossip. Put you up to this, didn't he? And Justin Sneed's not stupid, and they're threatening him with death. And so he gets the signals from the detectives, here's a path that we can offer you. And so he starts feeding them just what they want to hear. He gave 8 different versions of what happened. And then he sees the road home for him to get out from under the death penalty is to implicate Richard Glossip. There's no forensic evidence. There's no physical evidence against Richard Glossip. And he is facing death. How did I get involved? And this is a sneaky Jesus thing. I had written a couple of letters to Richard, not many, and then somebody set me up with a phone call with Richard. And I'm on the phone with him for the first time. It's January the 5th. He had an execution date for January 29th. And he goes, "Sister Helen, I hope you don't mind. I know I didn't ask your permission or anything, but I put your name down to be with me if I'm executed." And so I'm being summoned then. A man is asking me to accompany him. And I have accompanied 6 people to execution. And now I'm getting a summons from this man, whom I barely know, talking to for the first time. And I bolted awake that night, thinking to myself, there's no way I'm just going to walk with a man to execution. And I began looking into the case. I went, this guy's innocent. But I know by now how broken it is. My second book, The Death of Innocence, is talking about a broken criminal justice system that's executing the innocent as well as the guilty, because they're all poor people and they get poor defense, so the truth doesn't come out at trial where it should. There's a Psalm 81 that says, "Unseen, you answered me in thunder." And so I started getting involved with Richard. Right away, I got a ticket, went to Oklahoma, went to visit him. We had a press conference to start getting out the truth and the questions about the doubt around this man. And here you enter into the system. So you have the governor who said, look, he's had 2 trials. He's had his day. He's had his clemency hearing before the Board of Pardons. It's been to the appeals courts. Everybody's upheld it. He's had his day in court and then some. What has been done is justice. And so we don't need all you outsiders and people coming in here and telling us how to do justice in Oklahoma. And she dug in her heels. Her name is Governor Mary Fallin. The prosecutor's office is saying, yeah, look, it was done. He had not just 1 trial, but 2 trials. 2 juries did this. He's got to be guilty. Because look, the whole system, he's been through the system, so he has to be guilty. So I knew what we had to do, just from fighting before with other cases. We had to get a good pro bono group of lawyers, because nobody's paid to save Richard Glossip's life. And we're going to have to find a crackerjack constitutional lawyer who's going to be able to write to get to the Court of Criminal Appeals what's called a successor petition. Very difficult to do, almost impossible to do, because he's been through the courts. How do you get a Court of Criminal Appeals to listen to new evidence that this man was innocent? And so that's what we've been doing. We had to get money to hire investigators to go. And Don Knight, who got summoned into this whole thing, said, whenever somebody does a crime like Justin Sneed, he always talks to somebody. And part of our job is going to be to find witnesses who've been in jail with Justin Sneed or prison with Justin Sneed and overheard Justin Sneed saying how he put it over on Richard Glossip, and we had to go to find those people, investigators, working against time. And that's what we did. The other thing is, I knew that what we needed to do was to get the word out to the American people, to the court of public opinion, because this is a betrayal of the people of Oklahoma to kill an innocent person in their state. And we, the citizens of this country, we're supposed to have the best court system in the world. And so to get it out to the public. So I called the other Sister Helen, Susan Sarandon, and I said, Susan, and she's got a heart for justice. I said, Susan, look, I'm involved with this man. We need to start reaching out to the media. And so we began then. We got on CNN. Then we got on Dr. Phil. Everybody and their cat in this country watches Dr. Phil. And he had never done a program like this ever on the death penalty. I mean, in fact, he probably veers on the side of supporting the death penalty, whatever. But he was real glad to have Susan Sarandon on his show. I think he would have done anything for Susan. But I was in there too, and the lawyer was in there, and we started getting the word out to the American public. Richard has gotten over 1,000 letters from people who watched Dr. Phil and heard about his story of being an actually innocent man who's trying to get into court to prove his case. And Richard's been telling me about these. When I go to visit him and when I talk to him on the phone, he'll say, Sister Helen, listen to this. Here's this guy, he was about to commit suicide, and he just plopped down on his couch. The TV was on, Dr. Phil came on, and then he heard Susan read my statement about, well, if I am killed, I don't want to die, I don't want to be a martyr. But as long as my story gets out about, maybe it can show how broken the whole thing is, and maybe it can save other lives. And this guy writes me and said, I said to myself, man, get a grip. This guy's been 18 years on death row and he's innocent. And you helped save my life. I'm going to live. I'm taking a hold of my life. And he was getting letters like this from people all over. We had filed in to be witnesses for the execution on Wednesday, the 16th. Some of you were following this in your classes. And we had barely gotten in there. And I knew the lawyers had filed the day before at 4:30 in the afternoon. He was supposed to be executed at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. We who were the witnesses were brought in at 11:30 into this old waiting room. And then, just a few minutes later, 5 guys in suits walk in, one of whom was the director of the prisons, Mr. Patton. He said, there's been a stay of execution, and we're going to have a van come take you people out. And so Richard is alive. The lawyers are working against time like mad to gather other witnesses. They are gathering witnesses who heard Justin Sneed brag and laugh about how he had put it over on Glossip. And so they're finding everything they can to get it into this Court of Criminal Appeals to just say, look at this case and see if this man doesn't deserve a new hearing and a new trial. I didn't start out being involved with cases like this. I was a teacher of 7th and 8th graders. I've always taken seriously my prayer life to be, a person of prayer and meditation. When I talk about that awakening, it was awakening to the gospel of justice in a way I never had. It's the first part of the story in Dead Man Walking. And that Jesus was on the side of the poor, what Pope Francis is calling us to. And I had grown up in privilege. My daddy was a successful lawyer in Baton Rouge. I grew up in the days of deep segregation in the South, in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Black people in Sacred Heart Church didn't even sit with white people. That's how segregated we were. And I never questioned it. Because when you're part of the culture, people are not bad, but they just say, well, honey, that's the way we do things. It's better for the races to be separate. I never questioned the suffering of a black family traveling, and the father couldn't even get his family in at the motel, even to use the bathroom. I never questioned what it meant when families were growing up and their kids they knew were going to meet the racism, and that their kids would be taunted, and perhaps their kids would even be physically hurt simply because they're black. But when I awakened to justice, I did a simple action, actually. I moved into the St. Thomas housing projects in New Orleans, which I'm sure was about 1/16 of a mile from the suburbs of St. Francis Cabrini Parish, where I've been serving as teacher, then adult education director, and moved in among African American people who became my teachers. And it was like another country. All the rules were different. What happened to the young men with the police was different. And the sisters, we were there and we were watching it. Everybody had guns. There was violence everywhere. There were drugs everywhere. There was a greased rail from each of those houses. Everybody had someone in prison. And I worked in an adult learning center. And I had had such a great education like you getting here at Scranton. I'd had a great high school, Sisters of St. Joseph. I'd gone to college. I knew how to write. I knew how to speak. I knew how to articulate what I believed. I learned how to have an agency in my life, to be an agent for change, for things I believed in, with faith in Jesus at the center of it. Jesus is like a fire. Jesus is like an energy. Faith that takes hold of us energizes us to act, and it widens our hearts to compassion in ways we never even knew we would have. I had never thought much about people on death row. I never thought much about all the people who went to prison. And then in St. Thomas, I see people coming into the adult learning center, and I think of the excellent education I got. I began to be in touch with my privilege, not just from my father being a successful lawyer and being able to go to college like you're doing here at Scranton, but also from just the fact that I was born with a white skin, and I might get into big arguments with people and they don't like me for other reasons, but nobody's ever gonna look at me funny when I walk in a room simply because of the color of my skin. And I begin to learn things like the kids who were coming to the Adult Learning Center who had dropped out of the public schools in New Orleans. And here's a kid who'd been a junior in high school. And so we said, look, we're going to work with you on an individual level now, and we're going to see what your reading level is, see what your math level is. And a kid couldn't read a third grade reader, and he's a junior in high school, and he's going to graduate in a year. And what's going to happen to a young African-American kid, even if he had graduated and he couldn't read? And it threw me back on, why did I receive so much? And I realized people are going to jail, people are going for drugs, there's violence, people have guns. And it's not that I was so virtuous, it's just I was so protected. I was so cushioned. I'd been given so much. An intact family of love, faith, education, challenge. And so my experience with the people in the St. Thomas housing projects, it's while I was there that one day, coming out of the Adult Learning Center there on St. Andrew Street, friends who worked in the Louisiana Coalition of Jails and Prisons were right around the corner in New Orleans on Magazine Street. And one of the people who worked there had a clipboard, and everybody he met that day, he's inviting them to be part of a project. And he happens to bump into me. And he goes, hey, Sister Helen, you want to be a pen pal, somebody on death row? And I said, yeah, sure, I could do that. I didn't know they were going to execute this guy. We hadn't had an execution in Louisiana in like over 20 years because there'd been a moratorium in the whole country. I hadn't even noticed that the Supreme Court put the death penalty back. So he gives me the name of this guy, Pat Saunier. I had no idea when I wrote that letter it was going to change my whole life. And you know what the problem was? I wrote the letter, and the guy wrote back. That was the problem. He wrote back. And we had an encounter. Pope Francis, Gospel of Encounter. Go into the margins. Go to where people are who are not like us at all. The church should be a field hospital where people are hurting, where injustice, where they have no voice. And that happens to me. I didn't call it by that name, but I began to write to the man on death row, and he wrote back, and I realized he didn't have anybody to visit him. And so I said, look, I'll come visit you. And in Dead Man Walking, when I wrote the book, I'd never written a book before, but I wrote it in first person present tense so I can take you with me into all those experiences. So you're with me in the car, and we're going to visit him for the first time. Scary. I'd never been in a prison. And when you go into the visitor room, there's this big green sign. I mean, in New Orleans, you get a lot of respect because you're a nun. It's a Catholic city. Half the people in the city were taught by nuns. But Louisiana State Penitentiary, anybody stepping on prison property, be searched, body cavities, dogs sniffing, I'll stop reading the sign. I went, well, I ain't going to cut me any slack because I'm a nun here. What am I doing? And then this guard said, we'll take you to your man. And it was all these clanging of metal doors. There are no soft sounds in a prison. And we rounded a corner, and there was a green metal door, and above it there were red block letters, and it said, Death Row. We'll go get your man. And they go to get Patrick Saunier. And we're about to have our first conversation. So they lock me in a room, and I'm pacing, holding onto my cross, saying, Jesus, help me. I mean, Jesus. Because I started being nervous about him, because, see, I never talked to a murderer before. We had 2 hours. I was thinking, are we going to, is his face even going to, I had never seen him. Anybody can be polite in a letter. And then the guards brought him in. They put him in a very small, almost as big as a telephone booth. It had this heavy mesh screen in front of it, metal screen. And I was glad it had that metal screen, because I was alone with him. And I looked through that heavy mesh screen. And you know, contemplation doesn't just happen when we go away on retreat. We have a quiet time. It happened at that moment because I looked through that metal screen into the eyes of a man that I knew was a murderer, didn't know the crime yet. And when I looked into his eyes, that grace Whatever he has done, he is worth more than the worst thing he's ever done. And the 2 hours flew by. I'm driving back to New Orleans. I didn't want to be naive about the crime. He didn't talk about the crime. At first I thought, well, we had that whole 2 hours. He didn't even talk about what he did. He murdered somebody. And then I thought to myself, the first time you meet somebody, you're going to share the worst thing you ever did in your life. It was going to take trust. But I didn't want to be naive. But I went to the Prison Coalition office and I said, could I have a background file on the Saunier case? They say, sure. And they pull out all these manila envelopes, a whole stack of them, and I opened up the one on the top of the stack. And I want to tell you that months had gone by and I had begun to visit Pat and his brother Eddie. Eddie had been sentenced to life for the same murder. I don't know what it is yet. But I opened up the one on the top, and there I looked into the faces of 2 beautiful teenage kids, David LeBlanc, who was just 17 years old, Loretta Bourque, who was 18 years old, and this terrible, bold headline, teenagers found murdered. And then I read the terrible details of how these 2 brothers, Pat and Eddie Saunier, on a November night, when these 2 kids had come to a place to park after a football game, and they had done this with other teenage couples. Nobody had been killed. But these 2 kids are found lying by that sugarcane field. Loretta had been raped at least once, and they were both been shot, execution style, in the back of the head. And that's the murder that the man I was visiting had done. I had never encountered such evil. I had never encountered good people, parents, getting up in the morning, seeing their kids, going out to a football game on a Friday night and not knowing the last time they're going to see their boy alive, the last time they see their girl alive is as she's leaving for the game, as he's leaving for the game. And they say things like, did you clean your room? Or the hem of your skirt's out. And later looking back saying, if I had known those were going to be the last words to my child, I would have told her how much I loved her. All of this, and they are about to be plunged into this terrible ordeal of losing their children in the most violent way, and the sheriff's deputy at the door calling on the fathers to come to the morgue and identify their children. So when I saw the crime that he had done, I began another part of the journey in my own heart of the horror of it and guilt. I felt guilt because when I read the crime, I thought, what am I doing? I'm the spiritual advisor to the 2 people who killed these innocent kids. And I made a big mistake at that point because I thought of the parents and I thought, I ought to go see those parents. I began to pray for them, but I didn't reach out to them because I was scared. I said, they're not going to want to see me. I'm the last person in the world they're going to want to see. And it was a mistake. It was a terrible mistake because you know what I met? The victims' families. I met them face to face for the first time. The last step in Louisiana before somebody's executed is a pardon board hearing, and it's public, and all the victims' families are there with all their relatives and friends. And why am I at the pardon board hearing for Pat Saunier? I'm there with a lawyer and with one psychiatrist to ask that pardon board not to kill Patrick Saunier. And that's when I met the parents. And how could they not see me as an enemy? I'd done it all wrong. I hadn't called them. I hadn't written to them. And I ran into them at that pardon board. The Bourque family was just furious with me. Their daughter had been killed, and they just averted their gaze and walked by me. And right behind them were the boy's parents, and I expected the same anger which I deserved. And Lloyd LeBlanc, the father of David, who was just 17, and his wife Eula, surprised by grace, they walked right up to me, and Lloyd LeBlanc said, Sister Helen, All this time you've been visiting with those two brothers, you didn't once come see us, sister. Sister, you can't believe the pressure we're under with this death penalty. And he had been the one to stand up for the families at the meeting when they said, and what are the desires of the families? And he said that the execution be carried out. He said, sister, where have you been? He said, sister, and here's where the grace came in. He said, look, I pray in this little chapel, St. Martin of Tours Church. We keep vigil before the Blessed Sacrament through the night, and my hour is on Friday morning from 4 to 5. Come pray with me, sister. And indeed I did. That was an invitation of grace. I had done it all wrong, but that man reached out his hand to me, and I went to pray with him in that chapel. And I knelt alongside a man, and we prayed the sorrowful mysteries of the suffering and death of Jesus. And I'm kneeling alongside a man who's praying through the agony and suffering and death of his only son. And it was during his prayer where I got the first glimpse of his soul. Because he not only prayed for his family, the safety of teenage kids, the Bourke family, but in there was a prayer for Pat and Eddie Saulnier's mother, Mrs. Saulnier, who lived in the same small town that he lived in. And he knew what that mother was going through in that town. She'd go into a grocery store and she'd overhear people saying, there she is, that's Gladys Saulnier. It's her sons that killed the Bourke and the LeBlanc kids. What's she doing in here? And he knew people were cutting up dead animals and throwing them on the front porch, that the hatred extended to her sons was being extended to the mother, and he prayed for her. And this man, he's the hero of Dead Man Walking. I'm not the hero. I'm a storyteller, and I made some bad mistakes. But he took me into his heart and a journey of how is it possible that you could lose your only son and be plunged into this crucible of suffering and trauma and come out of it whole. How is that possible? And the way he put it to me was, he was the first victim's family I ever met who taught me that forgiveness is not first and foremost what you do to relieve the guilt and burden of the one who hurt you, though it may do that. But it was, he said, sister, when I said I was under pressure, you can't believe the pressure we under with the death penalty. Sister, everybody was saying to me, Lloyd, you gotta be for the death penalty or it looked like you didn't love your boy. Everybody was saying that to me. And even Eula and I would go to Mass at different churches to just see if we could hear priests from the pulpit talk about the gospel of Jesus, about loving your enemy, about forgiveness. Nobody was saying it, sister, and you weren't there for me either. And so he said, with all those people telling me that, he said, I went there. I did. I pictured myself killing both the brothers, strapping them both in a chair and pulling the switch real slow so they'd have a painful death, because I wanted them to experience pain because of the pain Eula, my wife, and Vicky, my daughter, and all of us are going through because of what they did, taking David from us. And then he said, I began to notice about myself. I was angry all the time. You know, I'm snapping at Eula, I'm snapping at my daughter. And I've always been a kind person. I love to help people. Ever since I was a little kid, I love to help people. I'm good with my hands, I can fix things. If I'm driving along, somebody's broken down in the middle of the night on the highway, I'm gonna stop and I'm gonna help them because it's who I am. And I was losing it. And then he did his hand like this, and then he said, I said, They killed our boy, but I'm not gonna let them kill me. And he set his face to go down the road of the gospel, that Jesus would help him to arrive at a forgiveness so that he no longer had that hatred in his heart of wanting to hurt them in a way as bad as they had hurt him. And he found grace on that road. He said, sister, people think forgiveness is weak, like you're condoning what they did. Oh, you killed our son, I forgive you, like I'm condoning it. He said, condone it. David was only 17. Every time he has a birthday, we lose him all over again. Condone it. But they were killing me too. And I prayed for the grace. And that's why I say he's the hero of Dead Man Walking. And I hold up his story around this nation whenever I go to give a talk about a victim's family and how you can have wholeness. Think of it. Can it really help a victim's family? And you understand in the current, when they come out of the courtroom and they just had the trial and they got V for victory, yay, we won, he got the death penalty. And then they start to wait 10 years, 15 years. I've been inside the killing chamber in Texas, and there are 3 witnessing stations there. And one is for the 12 witnesses for the state who look through this one-way glass to the person being executed. Across from them, above, kind of even with the head of the person who's to be executed, are representatives from the victim's family who are sent to watch the execution, their justice. This is their justice that they're promised. And they might have waited 15 or 20 years for this moment to come. And in that other place of witnessing is right where you look right into the face of the one on the gurney, and it's where mothers have stood with their hands against that glass to watch as the state of Texas kill their child. Where does it bring us? Can, by witnessing the violence of the state, could that ever heal a human heart? And I've met incredible people like Bud Welch in Oklahoma. I stay at his house when I go for Richard. His daughter Julie was killed in the Oklahoma City bombing. And he said, if I could have gotten Timothy McVeigh between my 2 bare hands, I would have snuffed the life out of him and snapped him like a matchstick. And he couldn't wait to see him die. And then he's noticing. It's the same thing that Lloyd was saying. I'm angry all the time. He's drinking to go to sleep at night. He's drinking to get going in the morning. He's smoking 5.5 packs of cigarettes a day. And his moment of grace comes when he goes to touch the knob of the car radio about 2 months after Julie had been killed. He goes to touch that knob, and he remembers being in the car with Julie, who had graduated from Marquette University, who was in the Murrah building that day when the bomb went off because she was translating for some person who needed to get his social security straight, his beautiful daughter who knew 3 languages, who too had received a Jesuit education and knew about being a person for others. His daughter snapped out of life by that bomb that day. And when he goes to touch that knob, he remembers being in the car with Julie, and the news was on the car radio, and they were talking about an execution in Texas, and she had turned to her father, and she had said, Dad, that's just legalized revenge. They're killing the one who did the killing. I'm not for the death penalty, are you, Dad? And he realizes to honor Julie and who she was, that he could not ask for the death of Timothy McVeigh. He was the first one of those 168 families to stand under what they call the survivor's tree, where they would gather and say, I am not for the execution of Timothy McVeigh. And everybody thought he was crazy, he had lost it, he had gone off the deep end. We have incredible human beings in this country who are our cloud of witnesses who are teaching us, and the victims' families are among those people. A growing cloud of witnesses are people that have to work at the executions. We have the warden, Ron McAndrews from Florida, who was there for 2 executions in Florida. He was the presiding one there while they carried out the executions. He gives public talks saying, I am still in therapy. I got into the profession as warden because I wanted to run a good institution to help restore life to prisoners and to keep people safe. And here I got involved in this rendering a person defenseless and killing them. The guards, I tell the story of one guard in Dead Man Walking who had been a part of 5 executions, and he said, "Sister, I come home afterwards. I know it's all legal. I get in my lazy boy chair and I can't sleep and I can't eat because I know them. I served them all breakfast. I've been the supervisor on death row. And you got to take a man and you render him defenseless and you kill them. And when I had a chance to have a dialogue with Pope John Paul about the death penalty, that was a question I asked him. I said, Your Holiness, I get it that we stand for the dignity of innocent life, the innocent life of children and unborn babies and elderly people who shouldn't be put to death through euthanasia. I get it. But, Your Holiness, when I'm walking with a man to execution, and this was Patrick Saunier, he was the first, and they come to get him, and he has leg irons on, he has hands handcuffed to a belt close to his waist, he's surrounded by 6 guards, and he says to me, "Sister, please pray as I walk that God holds up my legs." And I said, "Your Holiness, where is the dignity in this death?" To protect society, yeah. I get it that we have to protect society, but as Pope John Paul himself said, so now we have prisons as a way of doing that. We don't need to kill people anymore. And that's in my 2nd book. And when Pope John Paul came to St. Louis in '99, dialogue was going on all over the place on this. When he came in '99 for the first time, he was the first pope to put the death penalty in with the other pro-life issues. And he said, no to abortion, no to euthanasia, no to physician-assisted suicide, and no to the death penalty, which is cruel and unnecessary. And even those among us who have done a terrible crime have a dignity that must not be taken from them. I want to invite you to descend into these issues because the gospel of Jesus is who brings us up against the realities of what's done. And we're always going to be given the cultural picture. We're always going to be having the politicians running for office saying, we got to do this, we're going to be tough on crime. We're going to show people, don't kill in our state. It's bound to be a deterrent. Everybody has self-preservation. And so we have the death penalty and they think, oh, well, I don't want to lose my life. And they put out all these arguments. But finally, what it amounts to is finally then what I experienced with Pat and the 5 others and almost with Richard the other day, is that a human being is taken from his cell, and granted he did a terrible crime. And we need to stand in the presence of the horror of what was done to those innocent teenage kids. And you find yourself in your heart doing this balancing act between the horror of what was done to the victims and standing there recognizing that, and on the other hand, the dignity of this life that's about to be taken in our names, legalized by the Supreme Court, legitimized often by quotations from people from the Bible saying this is what God wants us to do. And I think of the cross as a symbol of the struggle in our own hearts on this issue. Because on the one, you have the victims' families who have suffered. On the other arm of the cross is the perpetrator. And the gospel of Jesus there is in the middle, in our hearts, calling to us. So where will we stand? And it doesn't mean we don't struggle with it. It doesn't mean when we read about a terrible murder, there's a part of us that rises up and said, well, whoever did that deserves to die. But there's an underside of that moral question. Who deserves to kill the one who killed? What sense does it make to us to legitimize violence as a way of making it redemptive, that if we kill the one who killed, we will heal ourselves as a society? And now we know we're making all kinds of mistakes. There are 155 wrongfully convicted people who have managed to get off a death row, saved by kids like you and volunteer innocence projects who work with lawyers to go get the evidence that was never presented at trial. How many innocent people have gone to their death in this country? But it's not just for the innocent. What about when they're guilty? And the way that Tim Robbins and Susan Sarandon, and I work closely with them, constructed the journey that is in the film of Dead Man Walking, we are not dealing with an innocent person. We're dealing with a guilty person. And then we're facing it head on. Can't we kill him? Doesn't he deserve to die? And these are the questions that we want to dig into. And how beautiful that you're in a community of faith here in this Jesuit university, inspired by the values of Ignatius and these champions of justice, to be people for others and people who work for justice, to recognize the privilege in our own lives and what we've been given, why us, and then to extend our lives to be persons for others and persons who work for justice and who follow the example of Pope Francis, to go out in the margins, to go out to the places where people are crying for justice and they can't make their voices heard. Will we become that voice for them? Will we be the person? We just ordinary people. There's nothing special about me. I just tried to pray, tried to listen, tried to follow as it came. And when we awaken, we know it's grace. And God gives us energy and life and even joy in the midst of the work. Thank you.